The February cold came off Lake Superior like it had a grudge, and Vera Sutton buried her husband on a Tuesday with $12 to her name and nowhere left to go. The service lasted 20 minutes. Father Broussard spoke words she didn't hear. The Halverson brothers stood at the back of the small Anglican church in Sault Ste. Marie, not out of respect for Edmund, but out of habit, the way men who want something always position themselves near exits. Edmund's cousin, Gordon Halverson, found her before the gravediggers had finished. "There's the matter of the deed," he said. "He didn't take his hat off. Edmund signed something before he passed. You should know about it." Vera kept her eyes on the frozen ground. "Tomorrow? Today would be better. My brother's come up from Sudbury." She looked at him then. Gordon Halverson was 43 years old and had the face of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. His brother Clifford stood behind him, shorter, thinner, but with the same calculation behind the eyes. "Give me an hour with my husband," she said. Gordon's mouth arranged itself into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Of course. We'll be at the house." She stood at Edmund's grave for the full hour, not because she needed to grieve. She'd been grieving for 2 years, since the consumption took his lungs and left him mean and frightened in equal measure, but because she needed to think. When she finally walked the half-mile back to the house that had never quite felt like hers, she already knew what they were going to say. She just didn't know yet how bad it would be. It was bad. The solicitor's name was Nesmith. He had the look of a man who had arranged this particular meeting many times before and found it tedious. He laid the papers on Edmund's kitchen table without ceremony. "Your late husband's estate includes the property at 14 Garrison Street, the fishing license registered to Sutton & Sons, and a debt of $460 owed to Gordon Halverson, secured against the property." Nesmith folded his hands. "The debt is due in full within 30 days of Mr. Sutton's death. $460. Edmund had told her the debt was manageable. Edmund had told her many things. "And the property? Should you default on the debt, the property reverts to Mr. Gordon Halverson as the secured creditor. And if I pay, then the property is yours free and clear." Nesmith said it the way people say things when they already know the answer. Vera had $12. The fishing license was worth something, but not $400 and not in February. Gordon set a document on top of the solicitor's papers. "There's another option. Edmund and I discussed it before he passed." He sat across from her, unhurried, like a man at cards who already knows what he's holding. "My son Percival is 26. He needs a wife. A practical woman, not one of these girls who wants poetry in parlors. The house and the debt both disappear if you marry him within the month." Vera looked at the document, then at Gordon, then at his son Percival, who she now noticed standing in the hallway doorway. Percival was 26 years old and had his father's eyes and his father's mouth and absolutely no expression of his own. "Your son doesn't look like he wants to be here either," she said. "Percival understands the importance of consolidating family assets. So did Vera. She understood it perfectly. She was 28 years old and she was being appraised like a piece of property herself, and every person in this room, including the solicitor, understood that, and nobody found it remarkable. "I'll give you my answer in 2 weeks, she said. 1 week, Gordon said. The solicitor has other matters. Walked 3 blocks to the telegraph office. Spent 4 of her $12 on a message to her cousin in Winnipeg, asking if she could come. The telegraph back arrived the next morning. They had 6 children and a 1-room house and were sorry. She spent 2 days doing the arithmetic. There was no version of it that worked. She had no trade except running a household, no family within reach, no savings. Edmund's fishing license might fetch $80, but not in winter, and not quickly. The boarding houses downtown were $1 a week minimum. She had $12. On the 3rd day, she went to the lending library and asked the librarian, a woman named Mrs. Tench who had survived 2 husbands and looked entirely at peace with the world, if there was a directory of employment opportunities in the Western Territories. Mrs. Tench did not ask why. She produced a 3-month-old copy of the Western Canadian Settlers Gazette and pointed to the back pages. Vera sat at the reading table for 2 hours. She read every listing twice. Most were for men. A few were for domestic servants in Calgary or Regina, wages low enough to confirm that escape was barely possible. And then, near the bottom of the last page, almost as an afterthought, rancher widower, 2 children, boy 9, girl 6, seeks capable woman for housekeeping and homestead management, Red Deer District, Alberta. Correspondence welcomed. References appreciated but situation understood. Inquire to J. Callender, Torchwood Station, Alberta. She read it 4 more times. Capable woman, homestead management, situation understood. That last phrase. She'd noticed it. Someone had written that with intention. She borrowed paper from Mrs. Tench and wrote a letter. She told the truth, or most of it. She was 28. She was newly widowed. She had managed a household, kept accounts, preserved and pickled and sewn and organized, had no money and no prospects in Sault Ste. Marie, and was looking for a position that offered stability in exchange for honest work. She did not mention Edmund's debt. She did not mention Gordon Halverson. She said only that her circumstances required her to leave soon. She mailed it with the last of her money and told herself not to hope. The reply came in 11 days. It was written in a hand that was careful rather than elegant, the hand of a man who wrote rarely and chose his words accordingly. Mrs. Sutton, your letter was direct and that's worth something. The position is as stated. The work is considerable. I have 40 head of cattle, 120 acres under lease, a house that needs more than I have time for, and 2 children who need more than I have left to give them. I cannot offer much except a roof and fair wages, and the understanding that you would be employed, not obligated in any other sense. If that arrangement suits you, there is a train that reaches Red Deer on the 14th. I will meet it. James Callender. Vera read it twice. Read the line again. Employed, not obligated in any other sense. She didn't know yet if that was a promise or just words, but it was more than Gordon Halverson had offered, which was nothing that resembled a choice at all. She packed everything she owned into one trunk and a carpet bag, left the key to 14 Garrison Street on the kitchen table, did not say goodbye to Gordon or Percival or Clifford, walked to the station in the gray February morning, and bought a ticket west with the $1.50 she'd gotten selling Edmund's pocket watch to the pawnbroker on Queen Street. The train took 2 days. She slept sitting up and ate the bread she'd packed and watched the shield give way to the flat, impossible openness of the prairies. She had never been farther west than Sudbury. By the time the train pulled into Red Deer, the cold was a different kind than she knew. Drier, sharper, the sky so enormous it made her feel slightly unreal. She stepped onto the platform with her trunk and her bag and looked around for a man who looked like he'd written that letter. She spotted him before he spotted her. He was standing at the far end of the platform with his hands in his coat pockets and the specific stillness of a man who doesn't fidget. He was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way of people who work outdoors through all seasons. His face was weathered past his years. She guessed he was somewhere around 38, and he looked at the arriving passengers the way a man looks when he's prepared to be disappointed. Then he saw her looking at him, and something shifted slightly in his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like recognition. "Mrs. Sutton," he said. "Mr. Callender." He picked up her trunk without asking. She fell into step beside him. He had a wagon and 2 horses waiting outside, a bay and a roan, both well kept in a way that told her something about him before he said another word. "It's about 40 minutes, he said. "Roads passable." "All right." He didn't make conversation, and neither did she. She watched the land open out around them, coulees and scrub, and the occasional stand of poplar, the sky going pink and orange along the western edge. When the ranch house came into view, she took it in honestly. It was not a prosperous house. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her what he prioritized, which made sense. The fence lines were tight. The yard was cluttered but not disordered. Someone was managing here just barely. 2 shapes appeared in the doorway before the wagon stopped. A boy of about 9 and a girl slightly younger, both watching her with the careful attention of children who have learned that adults don't always stay. "This is my son, Everett," James Callender said as she climbed down. "And my daughter, Ruth." Everett nodded with grave formality. Ruth stared at her carpetbag. "How do you do?" Vera said. "You're from Ontario." It wasn't a question. "Sault Ste. Marie." "Yes." "Papa says people from Ontario don't know anything about cattle." "Everett." James Callender's voice was quiet. "He's right," Vera said. "I don't know anything about cattle. I know how to keep a house and cook for people and do accounts." "Is that useful?" Everett considered this with unsettling seriousness. "The last woman burnt the porridge 3 days running." "I've never burnt porridge in my life," Vera said. Something in the boy's posture relaxed fractionally. Ruth, she noticed, had come 2 steps closer. The work was considerable, as advertised. She was up before anyone and in bed after everyone. The house had been running on a kind of organized desperation. Food was made, clothes were washed, but nothing had been properly mended or properly cleaned in longer than she wanted to estimate. She didn't say any of this. She just began. James Callender largely left her to it. He was out before dawn and came in at dark. He said little at supper and was polite in the way of someone who had decided politeness was safer than engagement. She did not push past it. She had learned with Edmund that the spaces men made around themselves were usually there for a reason. The children were easier. Everett was wary and testing for the first 2 weeks. She caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, cataloging her failures and non-failures with scientific detachment. Ruth was quieter, a small, serious girl who spent a lot of time near the kitchen window looking out at the yard. On the second Thursday, Vera found her sitting in the barn loft by herself. Not crying, just sitting, and decided not to ask why. Just handed up a piece of bread with butter and sat on the step below, and they stayed like that for a while. Mama used to bring me up here, Ruth said eventually. It's a good place, Vera said. That was all. But after that, Ruth started appearing in the kitchen when Vera was working, not helping or talking, just being there in the same room, and Vera counted that for something. The first crisis came 3 weeks in. She found the account ledgers in the drawer where James kept them and spent a Sunday afternoon with them when everyone was at church. She hadn't gone. Had told James she had bread to set, which was true but secondary. The numbers told a story she recognized. The ranch was behind, not catastrophically, not yet. But the lease payment was due in April, and the cattle prices had been poor all autumn, and there was a note at the local supply merchant in Torchwood that was going to come due in May. The margin was thin and getting thinner. When James came home, she was still at the table. He stopped when he saw the ledgers. I wasn't prying, she said. I was doing the quarterly. I thought that was part of what you needed. A long silence. You can read those? Edmund was a poor bookkeeper. I kept his accounts for 4 years. She turned the ledger so he could see what she'd done. You're short for April if the Hargreave cattle sale doesn't come through. But if you sell the 2 steers separately and time it before the Easter market, you'd clear the gap. James Callender pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and looked at the ledger for a long time. My wife kept the books, he said. I'm sorry. She died 2 years ago, February. He said it the way people say things they've said many times, the words worn smooth from repetition. After that, I just kept going. Didn't look too closely at the numbers. Looking closely is useful. Yes. He turned the ledger page. Show me what you found. That was the first real conversation they had. After that, he came in earlier on Sunday evenings, and they went over the accounts together. He knew the land and the cattle and the market timing in ways she didn't. She could see patterns in numbers that he missed. It was practical. It was useful. She told herself that was all it was. Spring came. The April payment cleared, barely. She ordered seeds from the catalog and planted a kitchen garden that the previous household had let go entirely to weeds. Everett began appearing beside her on Saturday mornings, not talking, just digging with a second spade she'd found in the barn. She didn't remark on it. Some things were better left unremarked. On a Saturday in May, a letter arrived for James Callender from the Torchwood Land and Trust Company. She left it on the table with his other mail. But she'd seen the return address and she'd seen the expression on his face when he opened it. And that evening at supper, the silence was a different quality than usual. Is it about the lease? She asked. He looked up. I noticed the return address. He set his fork down. The children were looking at their plates. The lease is being reconsidered, he said. The district office has taken on a new manager. He's reviewing all the agreements under the old manager. Can they do that? Apparently they have the authority. The new terms would increase the annual payment by 60%. 60%, she did the arithmetic instantly. Insoluble. They could not absorb 60%. She could see from his face that he already knew this. What's the timeline? Decision by July 1st. New terms effective September. Who's the new manager? James was quiet for a moment. A man named Douglas Fenn. He came up from Calgary. He's been making changes across the whole district. He picked his fork up again. The children were still very carefully not listening. I've requested a meeting. She did not say, that may not be enough. She said, good. That night she lay awake thinking about it. In the morning she went to see Mrs. Alderton, who ran the Torchwood post office and generally knew everything worth knowing, under the guise of collecting a parcel. Mrs. Alderton was happy to talk about Douglas Fenn. He had arrived in February. He had already forced 2 families off leases in the district by renegotiating terms they couldn't meet. One of those families had moved to Edmonton. The other had taken Fenn's alternate offer, which involved selling mineral rights on their property to a development company Fenn had connections to. Vera walked home with her parcel and thought about that for a long time. The development company was based in Calgary. She looked it up in the business directory at the lending library in Torchwood. Its principals included a man named H. Douglas Fenn, the same man. She laid this information before James that evening after the children were in bed. He stared at the notes she'd written. He's doing it deliberately, forcing people off the land so his company can move in, or forcing them into signing over mineral rights to avoid losing everything. We don't have mineral rights. This is grazing lease. Not yet, but there was coal found near the Pierce property last autumn. I heard Mrs. Alderton mention it. If there's coal in this district, James stood up. She'd seen him still many times. This was the first time she'd seen him move like something breaking. He went to the window and stood there with his hands at his sides. I can't lose this place, he said. His voice was level, but she heard what was underneath it. My wife is buried here. The children. He stopped. I know. I've made the payments. Everyone. On time. I know that too. He turned around. In the lamplight, his face looked older than it had that first afternoon on the platform. What do you think I should do? She was surprised enough by the question that she took a moment to answer it. Edmund had never once asked her what she thought he should do. I think you shouldn't go to the meeting alone, she said. I think you should bring documentation of every payment you've made in full and on time for the entire term. I think you should ask, in writing, for the specific authority under which the terms are being revised, and I think you should send a copy of that written request to the district land office in Edmonton before you go to the meeting, so Fenn knows you've done it. James looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it since I walked home from Mrs. Alderton's. Something moved across his face that she didn't quite have a name for. All right, he said. Let's write the letter. They stayed up past midnight at the kitchen table. She drafted, he reviewed, she revised. The final letter was 5 paragraphs, polite and absolutely iron, citing the specific clauses of the original lease agreement and requesting chapter and verse on the authority for revision. She made 3 copies, one for the meeting, one for the Edmonton office, one to keep. The meeting with Fenn was on the 14th of June. She went with him. He hadn't asked her to. She'd simply appeared at the wagon at the appropriate time with the document folder and her good coat, and he'd looked at her for a moment and then made space on the bench. Douglas Fence was 40 and had the kind of assurance that came from having won most things he'd tried to win. He received them in the land office in Torchwood with barely concealed impatience. A rancher and his hired woman, he clearly thought, nothing complicated here. Then Vera put the documentation on the table, organized by date, tabbed with paper markers, with a summary sheet on top that showed the full payment history at a glance and the specific sections of the original lease agreement that governed term modifications. Fenn looked at the summary sheet, then at James, then at Vera, recalibrating. Your wife? He said to James. My employer, James said. It wasn't quite true, but it wasn't quite wrong either. Fenn picked up the summary sheet. She watched his face as he read it, a man who had expected a simple conversation and found himself instead in something more structured. The original agreement has a modification clause, he said. Section 14B. Section 14B requires written notice of 90 days and requires that any modification be consistent with district-wide policy adjustments. We've sent a request to the Edmonton office asking for the written policy adjustment that authorizes this particular revision. Vera kept her voice pleasant. We'll of course be happy to proceed with whatever the Edmonton office confirms is within scope. A silence. The Edmonton office review may take some time, Fenn said. We understand. We're in no hurry. She folded her hands. Mr. Callender's payments are current. There's no urgency on our end. Fenn looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked at James, who said nothing, which she thought was exactly right. I'll need to consult with the district office, Fenn said. Of course, Vera said. We appreciate your time. They drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon. The poplars along the road were fully leafed out, and the light was that particular northern gold that made everything look briefly like a painting. That's not over, James said. No, but it's slower now. Slower is better for us. You've done this before. Edmund's brother tried to take our boat and our license when Edmund got sick. I spent 4 months writing letters. She watched the road. We kept them. Did it help? In the end, we kept the boat and the license until Edmund died. Then his cousins moved in, and the letters weren't enough anymore. She said it without self-pity, just fact, but I learned what letters could do. James was quiet for a few minutes. The horses moved steadily. A hawk hung over the coulee to the west. I didn't know about any of that, he said. From your letter. It wasn't what you needed to know then. What did I need to know? She thought about it. That I could manage a household. That I'd be honest. That I wasn't coming with expectations you hadn't agreed to, she paused. The rest was personal. And I didn't know you. Do you know me now? It was a question she wasn't prepared for. Not from him, who chose his words like a man who knew the cost of them. Some, she said, more than I did. He didn't say anything else, but when they pulled into the yard and Everett came running from the barn, and Ruth appeared in the doorway, she noticed that for the first time since she'd arrived, James Callender smiled. Not a large smile, just a small, real one. July arrived, and with it 2 things. A letter from the Edmonton Land Office confirming that district-wide policy did not in fact authorize the revisions Fenn had proposed, and a Sunday afternoon that changed the shape of things. The children were down at the creek. James was fixing fence in the east pasture. Vera was in the kitchen when she heard a horse come into the yard fast, which was never good, and went to the door. The rider was a man she didn't recognize, middle-aged, dusty, from hard travel. He asked for James Callender by name. He's in the east pasture, she said. What's the matter? The man hesitated. It's about a man named Fenn. I've been riding to the ranches in the district. Fenn's made a complaint to the Land Commission in Calgary, says calendar interfered with official proceedings. They've put a hold on the lease pending review. She kept her expression calm by sheer force of habit. When did this happen? Filed 3 days ago. Ranchers have 60 days to respond. After he rode on, she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and thought for exactly as long as she could afford to. Then she took out the document folder and began drafting again. When James came in at dusk, she had 4 pages of notes and an idea she wasn't certain would work. He read the notes. He read them again. He looked at her. A petition, he said, from every family in the district that Fenn has approached. Not just us. If we're the only ones who push back, it looks like a personal dispute. If half a dozen families show they've all received the same pressure, it looks like a pattern. She spread the notes out. I need you to tell me which of your neighbors would sign, and I need to know if any of them have documentation. The Marchetti family lost their lease in March. Even better. They're not in the district anymore, which means Fenn has no hold on them. James sat down across from her. He looked tired and something else, not defeated, but close to the edge of it. She'd seen that look on Edmund near the end, the look of a man who had run out of moves and knew it. It was different on James. Edmund had gone soft and frightened when things closed in. James just went still, and the stillness felt more like bracing than giving up. If this doesn't work, he said, let's make it work. I'm serious, Vera. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Neither of them remarked on it. If it doesn't work, I need to know what we do next. I have 2 children, and I need to think past the moment. She met his eyes. If it doesn't work, you have options. Diminished options, but options. I can help you think through all of them. But I don't think it comes to that. Why not? Because Fenn is doing something dishonest, and he has been doing it to multiple families, and that's the kind of thing that ends badly for people once it's documented and in front of the right authority. She said it without flourish. He's counting on each family feeling isolated. We stop being isolated. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind was moving through the poplars. The lamplight was steady. My wife would have liked you, he said quietly. It seemed to surprise him that he'd said it. He looked away. Vera didn't answer. There was nothing to say to that, and some things were better let stand on their own. The next 3 weeks were the hardest and the most purposeful she'd spent in years. She rode with James to 4 neighboring properties. She explained the situation clearly to each family. She asked for documentation, for signatures, for memory of specific conversations with Fenn's office. People talked. She wrote it down. The Marchettis, now in Edmonton, sent a notarized statement by post. A widow named Mrs. Harriet Coop, who ran 40 acres on her own and who had so far resisted Fenn's pressure by the sheer force of her personality and a shotgun she kept visible on her porch, provided 2 years of lease correspondence that showed a pattern of incremental intimidation going back to Fenn's first month in the district. Vera organized it all, indexed it, wrote a covering letter that was 12 pages long, and cited specific statutes she'd looked up at the Torchwood Lending Library, which had a legal reference section she hadn't known about until she asked the librarian. James drove the package to the train station himself and sent it registered post to the Land Commission in Calgary and copied it to the Edmonton Federal Office and the Office of the Provincial Member of Parliament for the district. They waited. Fenn's response came first, a letter to James that was 3 pages of legal language amounting to a threat. She read it and felt the familiar cold calculation of someone who still has cards to play but knows the hand is turning. He's scared, she said. You can tell that from a letter? He spent 3 pages threatening you. If he were confident, he'd have spent 1 sentence dismissing you. She set the letter down. This is what it looks like when someone realizes they've underestimated the situation. James almost smiled. You're very certain about a lot of things. I'm certain about the things I've thought through carefully. Everything else, I'm guessing, same as anyone. The formal response from the Land Commission came 6 weeks later. The hold on the calendar lease was lifted. The commission had opened a formal review of Douglas Fenn's conduct across the district. They were requesting documentation from additional affected parties. There was one other thing in the letter, almost a footnote. The commission had referred the matter of Fenn's Calgary Development Company to the relevant commercial authority, given the appearance of a conflict of interest with his public role. Vera read the letter 3 times. Then she put it on the table in front of James, who was standing by the door still in his barn coat. He read it, set it down, said nothing for a long moment. It's not over, she said. The review will take months. But the hold is lifted. Yes, he sat down heavily in the chair across from her. She'd seen him handle hard things quietly for months. The lease threat, the petition, the waiting. Now something in his face was different. The way a rope goes slack all at once when the tension releases. We're all right, he said. It sounded like he was telling himself as much as her. For now, keep your payments current. Keep your documentation. If Fenn's conduct review goes where it seems to be going, eventually this district will have a different land manager. He nodded. Then, after a moment, I didn't know how to do this. Do what? Fight this way. The letters, the statutes, he gestured at the folder of documents on the table. I know cattle. I know land. I know how to fix fence and rotate pasture and get through a bad winter. I didn't know how to fight paper with paper. And I didn't know anything about cattle, she said. Or Alberta. Or how to read a coolie or what the sky looks like before a Chinook. She paused. We've been useful to each other. He looked at her. The lamp was burning low. Outside it was a clear prairie night, the kind where the stars were almost aggressive in their brightness. Is that what this is? He said. It wasn't quite a question. She was very careful with her answer. I don't know what else it is yet. I know what it isn't. It isn't what your letter promised and what I accepted. It's become something else. I haven't had time to decide what I think about that. I haven't either. Then maybe we let it be what it is for a while and see. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, that seems reasonable. Most things that last are built slowly, she said. She hadn't meant it as more than what it was, but she heard it land between them, and thought perhaps it was more than she'd meant. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. September came. The cattle sold well at the fall market, better than the year before. The kitchen garden had produced enough to put up 6 dozen jars of preserves and pickles that lined the cold room shelves in satisfying rows. Everett had learned, under her not-quite tutelage, to keep a household ledger, which he did with a seriousness that occasionally made her want to laugh and always made her want to let him. Ruth had stopped sitting in the barn loft alone and started bringing Vera things. Feathers, interesting stones, a piece of birch bark with a pattern that looked like a map of somewhere. The news about Douglas Fenn came through Mrs. Alderton in October. He had resigned from his position with the land office. The formal review had produced findings that were not, apparently, in his favor. 2 families in the district who had signed over mineral rights were consulting lawyers about recovering them. Vera received this news the same way. She'd received most of the difficult news of the past year. Standing in someone's kitchen, keeping her face neutral, filing it away to think about later, she told James that evening. He was at the table with the ledger. He looked up when she told him, and something settled in his expression that had been held slightly apart from settled for as long as she'd known him. Good, he said. That was all. But it was enough. Winter came early that year, the way Alberta winters sometimes do, arriving in November with snow that stayed. The house was warmer than it had been the previous February. Not because anything had been added. It was the same walls, the same stove, the same drafty north window she'd plugged with folded cloth, but because it was different inside it. She was in the kitchen on a Sunday when James came in from the barn and sat down across from her without his usual movement toward the stove or the coffee pot. I've been thinking, he said. She waited. What you came here for was employment. That's what I offered. I want to make sure that's still what you're getting. He looked at the table, and I want to make sure that whatever else this has become is something you've chosen and not something you've ended up in, because there wasn't an alternative. She thought about Gordon Halverson, about Percival with no expression of his own, about $12 and a trunk and a train ticket west and a letter from a man who wrote, not obligated in any other sense. I've had alternatives, she said. I chose this one at the beginning and I've kept choosing it. It's different now than it was then, but I knew it was getting different and I didn't leave. He looked up at her. I'm not trying to find you something better, she said. In case that's what you're worried about. I'm worried about you having stayed out of practicality, because leaving is harder than staying. She considered that. It wasn't wrong, exactly. Leaving was always harder than staying when you had nowhere specific to go, but that wasn't why she was here. I stayed for the same reason I got out of bed at 5 every morning this winter, she said, because it's worth it. The work and the children and the land, and she stopped. You're worth it. I didn't expect that, and I didn't plan it, but there it is. A long quiet. I'm not easy to be with, he said. I've noticed. I'm not particularly easy either. You are. I'm practical. That reads as easy. It isn't the same thing. She folded her hands on the table. You don't have to offer me anything. I'm telling you what's true, whether you do or not. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was the first time he'd touched her deliberately, intentionally, without the context of handing her something or the ordinary proximity of shared work. His hand was large and very warm and had the specific roughness of hands that have been working outdoors since childhood. I'd like you to stay, he said, for longer than a housekeeper stays. If that's something you'd want, I'd want that, she said. Outside the window, the snow was coming down in the particular way it came down on the prairies. No urgency to it. Just settling in, covering everything in patient white. They didn't marry that winter. There was too much to do, and neither of them were people who moved towards ceremony quickly. But they married in the spring on a Thursday, in the kitchen with Everett and Ruth as witnesses and the circuit minister who came through Torchwood every 6 weeks. Vera wore a dress she'd made herself from good blue wool. Not the dress of a woman trying to make a moment larger than it was, but a dress that fit and was hers. James wore his good coat. Ruth had put a sprig of early willow on the table without being asked. There was no grand moment, no rescue, no riding off anywhere. The minister read what he was meant to read. They said what they were meant to say. Everett shook James's hand with great formality afterward, and then, after a moment's consideration, shook Vera's hand too. Ruth put her hand in Vera's and left it there. They ate supper. James did the dishes. Vera dried. It wasn't the life she'd imagined at 20, or even at 28, standing at Edmund's grave with $12 in her coat pocket. It was something harder-edged and truer, built from letters and ledgers and bad winters, and a petition sent registered post to Calgary from a boy with a second spade and a girl who collected maps from birch bark. Fenn's review concluded the following year. The findings were not published widely, but the effect was visible. 3 families in the district recovered their mineral rights. The new land manager was a quiet, methodical man who answered letters within 10 days, and the calendar lease was renewed for 15 years on the original terms. Vera didn't celebrate when the renewal papers arrived. She put them in the document folder, filed under land, and went back to the account she'd been working on. Some things you fight for, and some things you build toward, and some things, when they're finally secured, you just fold up carefully and put away and go on. That was enough. It was in fact everything.